Yeah. This is Eve Eurydice, and I want to tell you about my initiative for a universal mother income, which is very different from UBI, from Universal Basic Income. And the word universal is important because the way that I envision this is as a global initiative, so not just a national initiative for wealthy nations. The most fundamental idea about a mother income is that motherhood is a job. Mothering is work, it's hard work, and it is only because we're still hostage to vestiges of old patriarchy that we don't all officially recognize that. We all know it. We know it watching our mothers work. We know it when we become mothers. And it's one of the main reasons that fewer and fewer women who have access to other means of financial support think twice about becoming mothers, because it's expensive, because no one is really paying you to do an enormous amount of hard work, which is daily, which sometimes feels like it's 24/7. And in the old patriarchy, the setup, the trade, the exchange, was that the man was going to pay for the woman who would have children. In exchange, those children would be his children, and so man who is born without a womb would also get children. The way that worked for 5,000-6,000 years was really enforced. It was by enforcement. So no one had a choice. It was the way things were done. But that all changed sometime in the 70s, when we had the kind of extraordinary revolution in reproductive science. My feeling, this is parenthetically, my feeling is that the scientific revolution of the 70s, 60s, 70s, then 80s was a direct result of World War II in particular, when humanity as a whole had this reckoning that we could self-suicide, that we could let a few strong men who were in charge of the greatest countries with the greatest weapons on earth fight it out and take millions of us along to the brink of extinction. So I think there was such a moment of shock for everyone in the world, for humans at large, that there was a loss of trust in our governments and institutions, a loss of trust in our religions, very importantly, and a move toward science or scientism as a way out, because science had come up with the nuclear bomb, after all, right? So in that change, in that shift of the industrial age toward what has become kind of like a post-industrial, scientific, digital age, in that shift, a lot changes. And here is how it affects reproductive relationships. We had birth control. We had paternity tests, super cheap. We had, the DNA sequencing. We had suddenly people signing contracts for surrogacy. This, rather than the civil rights, we think that civil rights and then women's rights and then gay rights, right, liberated us. No, in fact, what happened is that capitalism changed focus because there were these new products, these new scientific developments, let's call them, that could be monetized for billions of dollars, and they have been, right? So everyone is on birth control. Everyone is using, if they need to, some sort of like, sperm bank or egg donor or IVF treatment. Abortion has become, a matter of course, super easy. And as a result, our procreative relations changed. as a result of that, not because we took to the streets and protested. That is a little naive. So it was because the market forces changed, and we got, gay marriage, and we got, social gender, right? The practice of changing gender as we will because we have divorced sex from procreation. So separating sexual activity which leads to children from actually having children, separating those two has been a fundamental moment of change in human existence for millions and millions of years, even before we were Homo sapiens, even before we were Homo, we depended on sex, hormones, in order to reproduce. And nature's only interest is this, reproduction. We're basically naturally programmed to reproduce, most of all. Then we can die, whatever. That's our one job when it comes to our natural programming. That is no longer our cultural programming. In the past few decades, our culture has kind of gone against our nature. And the feeling has been that culture has conquered nature, right? By cracking this secret of procreation, in a sense, we don't need nature anymore. In a sense, one could make babies in the lab. It is all a little too much for us to kind of comprehend and sit with, so we keep living our lives and we adjust to the changes in law, right? And we don't redefine our social programming in a way that matches these changes. So here we are at a moment where women can choose whether or not to become mothers. Women are also being paid to have other people's children, to carry them, to give birth to them, and to not think of these beings growing in their womb as theirs, which is really strange, again, considering the millennia that has gone before, and considering what the messages and the signals of our bodies are. Women can also be paid to look after wealthy people's children. They can be, paid to, raise, sing to sleep, educate wealthier people's children. So motherhood, in a sense, is paid as a job when it's surrogate motherhood, but actual motherhood with a mother present for the upbringing of children in a natural, holistic way is not. And the reason that it's not is that we still want to hold up this bargain of old patriarchy. For me to explain that, I'll have to take a parenthetic moment and kind of go a little bit into old patriarchy, which is not what we are now. We are now in what I call post-patriarchy. And because we haven't redefined our procreative relations, post-patriarchy is just a mess. It's a time of decline, it's a time of chaos, it's a time of clash, of cultural wars, we call them. All of that's happening because we don't really know the way, like what's right anymore, what's the way to go. So we have the traditionalists and the conservatives who want to push us back into old patriarchy, which clearly is obsolete, right? You can't just go back into the womb. There has been a huge change. We can't pretend that what has happened hasn't. And there are the progressives and the liberals who are ignoring procreation, ignoring mothers and motherhood, because that's an awkward, messy topic, and are just focusing on how to liberate us from patriarchy in superficial, performative ways. So you can say you're, this or that, and you can dress up that way, and you can act whatever way you want, which is great, but it stays stuck at the level of language and personality, right? Identity. It doesn't, in any fundamental way, change the procreative relations between people. And we live in a time where everything is financialized. The thousands of years during which we lived close to the land and we could survive off the land are not what's happening right now. So we are held hostage to wherever the money is coming from. The money is coming from a centralized authority, the boss. Whatever you want to call that authority, you can call it the elites, you can call it the patriarchy, you can call it the Fed, it doesn't matter what the name of that, that's where we are getting paid from. And unless we revisit what is work and get that authority to understand that motherhood is a job, we can get out of this swamp, of this, kind of like zombie limbo state that we're in as a post-patriarchy. So the patriarchy was conceived, to simplify it, the patriarchy was conceived as a way to bring men into procreation. And the war of culture, the war of culture against nature began as this very simple quest to get men into the procreation machine. So it wasn't just woman's monopoly. So the female gender, by nature, has a monopoly on procreation. Men's job, father's job, naturally speaking, ends with insemination, right? So a couple of seconds, unconscious, couple of seconds of pleasure, and the man's job's done. The sperm doesn't even begin to, fertilize the egg and then become the embryo for weeks. So really, he's far removed by then. The knowledge of paternity, when it became known to our ancestors that actually was one man, one baby, was a secret that was held by women. So men had no way of knowing whether or not they were fathers to anyone. And in a sense, procreatively speaking, again, we're focusing on reproduction. A man's job was to roam about, survive, and just impregnate as many women as he could without really knowing or participating further than that. So once we achieve consciousness as a species, which is primarily the consciousness of our mortality, the consciousness of death, then not having children, not having heirs, not having a place in family, in a sense, except as a son, becomes problematic and increasingly, painful for men because they're left out of the hearth once they are old enough to go out and seek mates and roam. And I think that what we call knowledge, what we call civilization, begins from that longing. What we have come to call, math, counting what you own, language, beyond the language of mating, which was just songs and, bird calls, basically, and cat calls. What we have come to call money, and everything that is now around us, all of our extraordinary inventions, begins there, with that pre-civilized men feeling left out. We can call it, womb envy, right? Uterus envy. So the need, the want to participate, to belong, to have children of your own to leave behind is what brings us to this inventiveness, to using the creative imagination in order to be of use to the family, whether it is shelter, whether it is protection, whether it is coming up with weapons for defense, right? So all of this happens before we even have what we now call the tribes. Our archaeological access stops before, before the patriarchy, like at the patriarchy, basically. We can only decipher ancient writings up to a certain time, but not earlier than that. So basically, we only understand patriarchal societies, which start with the beginning of the agrarian age. There are other writings that have been found, including on my island of Crete in Greece, that we cannot decipher. And it seems to me that one of the reasons we can't decipher them is because we can't understand those pre-patriarchal relations. But sometime with the thawing of the Ice Age, as the nomadic lifestyle and the roaming kind of like quieted down, and humans realized that they could stay at a place longer. So instead of just staying for a season and moving on, the weather became friendlier and they could stay longer and have the gardens longer and domesticate the animals, right? So they would find these welcoming areas, fertile areas, near bodies of water, rivers, harbors, and whereas in the past they had to keep moving as hunter-gatherers, now they could stay in those places longer and longer. With the beginning of the agrarian age, there was the need for a different kind of organization which suited this idea of fatherhood, right? So men became more useful. Men became useful as army, as a fighter, to defend kind of like whatever the settlement was, or builder, to build homes that would last longer. And gradually, because everybody was stable and close to each other, the knowledge that it's one man, one birth, came to us, came to humans. It's that consciousness that allows the patriarchy to happen. Until then, no one was sure if a woman had like 20 partners during her cycle, that you could know who the father was. Maybe it was a mix of everybody. it was just, the gods, Mother Nature, right? A mystery, a miracle. And the shamans, had access to this, but there was no knowledge. So again, we have huge changes in our history of consciousness, in our development as conscious, sentient beings. And the sense of self is related to mortality, and it's related to also reproduction, right? So that's why robots can't be sentient. They can think as an I, as a me, but in the natural sense of consciousness, that's what sets us apart from our brothers and sisters in the animal world. So the next, let's say, thought development in reproductive relations was that by making each man responsible for one womb and keeping that woman kind of like imprisoned under his control, home, borders for the span of her fertile years, from when she starts menstruating until she stops menstruating, then he can control who is the father, and he gets to be the father of those children, right? So that sort of enforced domestication, captivity of fertile women during that, the procreative years was, let's say, the hack to get men, fathers, into the family unit, and also to get them in the family unit from a position of power, right, as leaders, because they were the ones controlling the setup of captivity. But in exchange, the men had to pay a very, very, very big price, because they were also captive. They were captive to their captives, right? So, and not only they were captive to be kind of like, always watching the family members they were responsible for, but they were also captive to the whole, to the community, which became more and more hierarchical, because they had to pay some sort of tax. They were indebted to that system, right? So in order to support this fertile woman that they now became responsible for, they had to, what we now call, work, right? And even before the invention of money, they had to do for the group in exchange for this right? So it did not come for free. It came at a great price. And in a sense, that is the debt, the wages, right? The procreative wages of men to patriarchy. So men's deal, right, men's trade was not with women, it was with patriarchy. And that's who, what the system, that system was in charge. So the idea that any gender was in charge is flawed and false. It was kind of like a forced change on a mass level, because it spread, that completely epigenetically, our epigenetics change like every 100 years, again, every 500 years, right? Changed our way of thinking of what's natural, which is actually cultural, right? So we began to confuse what we naturally wanted to do with what we were culturally trained to do. And we took a lot of this in time for granted. And we raised our children, in time to put the interests of the patriarchy, of the city-state, of the nation, of the religious group, of whatever that ideological connective tissue was, before their own. And to put the interests of the family, with the father kind of like at the top of the pyramid, before their own. And the way the system enforced this was through patrilineage and inheritance, patrilineal inheritance. So the glue of this whole system was money. With the invention of money, everything starts to flow, because money oils and wheels, this system. It oils the wheels of this system, right? So money replaces the motivations that nature put in us. Whether it was the motivation of erotic attraction, or other physical experiences that would make us respond to them, money slowly replaces, in a sense, what the body has been, the programming of the body. And money is how it's all sustained, because man makes money and pays into the system and uses the money to support this, the wife, the mother of his children and support his children, and then leaves money behind so that this line, this lineage, this generational kind of like control goes on through after death, right? So without that, the whole setup makes very little sense, because if you start over at the end of everybody's life, you know, from scratch, the setup doesn't work. And that's why we compete so hard and fight so hard and fight about borders, which were invented along with everything else at, you know, sometime in the agrarian age, right? But all of these ideas were invented to sustain this basic setup. So fast forward, like 6,500 years, it's not that much, considering how long we've been around. I mean, we were hunter-gatherers for millions of years, so these are hundreds of thousands of years. This is nothing in the big picture, but it's a lot in our personal picture. From where we look at it, it's a lot, thousands and thousands of years. So here we are, World War II, a lot more changes besides reproduction, but the secret is no longer secret. The secret of paternity has been cracked. In a sense, patriarchy has no longer a reason to exist. Like, we no longer need it. You know, we no longer have to have sex in order to have children, and we no longer need to, like, captivate, you know, capture and keep still, let's say, within the home, the mother of the children in order to know who the father is. This is just like a huge change. So we have like serial marriages, and monogamy is pretty much finished, except, you know, for people who still want to do it, but it's no longer obligatory. All of these things become no longer needed, no longer obligatory. So whereas, you know, being a homosexual before that period was a crime, now, you know, homosexuals get married, have their own children, etc. So how do we get out of being stuck in this post-patriarchy? Well, money was the glue of the system, and money is how we can move forward without completely breaking apart. If we do nothing, we will break apart in a violent way. And we see signs of that all the time, because people are confused and they look around and they don't know whom to blame. So they fall for all kinds of demagogues. They will see enemies where there are no enemies, and there will be war, and it will cause a lot of young men to die. And culturally speaking, young men all of a sudden are no longer needed, because we're in a post-patriarchal stage. So women can make money. I mean, they're needed in the labor force, right? We are a global labor force. We have become a global labor force. That's what this whole multinational, you know, post-national corporate setup has been. So everything is financialized. The only solution is monetary. And the way to do it is to make motherhood a job. So man is free from having to support a wife in order to be a father. And a woman can have children without having to enter into the old patriarchal contract, right, of marriage or those arrangements, and she can be a mother as if she has a job, with benefits, with a down payment for a house, with a pension, not for the entirety of the mothering years, of course, but for the intense years, and also, which is the first, let's say, 6 or 7 years, and then after the first 6 years, she gets training and career services to go into a career of her choice. So I see this as a passage, as a bridge program into what we're going to become. And I see the organization of it similar to the Corps, right? So the Defense Corps is organized in a similar way. And I think that bringing the mother's body, the mother's job, which is the most fundamental for the survival of a nation and a species, into the responsibility of the government as well as all the different nonprofits is the only way forward. It's the only way to catch up to what has changed and to express it in the vast population, and not just among the few wealthy who can afford to do that. This is a very big topic, so I'm just giving you a glimpse. I have written a book about it on universal mother income. There's a lot more that you can read about on the topic. You can join my newsletter on Substack. You are always welcome to reach out to me with your questions. I am here to respond. At this stage, I only want to spread awareness and spread the word. And so the more that everyone understands about what this would mean, the better. I will make more videos about how we will monetize this, which, I have a very clear idea of what's needed to be done. So just stay with me and continue this conversation. Thank you.